The idea of food deserts was unknown to me a few years ago. I recognized my privilege in having access to nutritious fresh food, but still had a lot to learn about how certain areas are devoid of that basic necessity because of planning policies, politics, and economic factors. I still could not entirely gauge the idea of comparing access to supermarkets with my own experience of a robust network of vegetable hawkers and street vendors in India. So, we got in touch with urban geographer Dr. Jane Battersby, whose work focuses on the interactions between urban systems and food systems in the African context. She helped me understand why the supermarket metric is slightly flawed in the global south and how we should all advocate for food centric urban planning. I am Vaissnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight contemporary discourses that shape the built environment but do not necessarily occupy the center stage in our daily lives. We speak to radical designers, thinkers, and change makers who are deeply engaged in redefining the way we live and interact with the world around us. Let's begin. I'm excited for today. Because up until now, all the interviews I've done for this season are kind of micro in their outlook. A lot of them talk about products, about food, about larger questions. But today we're going to talk about some actual real planning, design, policy, economics, and the whole nexus of all of it. So let's get started with your early work, which was really talking about food security. If you could talk to us a little bit about that, and then we'll slowly slip into the other bigger, larger questions.
Absolutely. So I started doing research on food security in urban areas back in 2007, 2008. When we started doing the research, it was really very much around the conventional framing of food security. So it was looking at the household scale. What were the household determinants of food insecurity in urban areas? And this work started because there'd been a lot of focus on food insecurity in rural areas, and yet with the urbanization we're seeing, particularly in Africa, there was this realization that people hadn't really grappled with what food insecurity looked like in the urban context. However, in the process of doing this research, which was quite a large-scale survey, it became clear to me, at least, that although the experience of food insecurity was felt at the individual and household scale, the drivers were very much broader than that. And my sense was that food insecurity wasn't something that just happened in the urban, it was a product of the urban. And so it became clear that, actually the way in which we've designed our cities, the way in which people live, move, and have their being in cities was profoundly shaping how they could eat. And so that then led me to kind of emerge out of that household scale analysis to starting to think at kind of neighborhood scale, city scale, but then also what's happening in the micro geographies of the home.
I want to drill into something that we spoke about when we met for the first time, and that's this whole discourse, quite popular, on food deserts in cities or particular neighborhoods, so as to speak. And something that, I mean, I had no idea what food deserts were until I went to grad school in the US. And it seemed like everybody there was talking about food deserts. And it seemed like food, which is so essential to our survival, had kind of entered into architecture schools, into planning, into urban design, into policy. And of course, the discourse on food deserts in the US is quite elaborate. People have done a lot of work in terms of food deserts in California, food deserts, even in larger cities like New York City, where certain boroughs experience the phenomenon of a food desert. But when I was going through your work, what really appealed to me was it's not a direct translation in a different geography, but what happens in African cities and what your work is really trying to understand is the phenomenon of food deserts, but in a completely different way, shape, and format.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a fundamental problem with the kind of framing of food deserts, both as it's been created in the kind of US context, but then as it's been translated. And so what we've seen is this, initially the idea of food deserts kind of came out through food justice activists who were really honing in on the fact that in lower income areas of cities and rural areas, it was hard to get physical access to affordable, nutritious foods. And they didn't speak about any particular kind of retailing, but it was this general notion. And then in the US, it got picked up and turned into this very particular narrative, which was about kind of the absence of large grocery stores
Right.
in lower income areas. And in doing that, it kind of reframed the problem as one less about community agency and seeking community justice as, okay, we've got a problem that there's not enough grocery stores. The solution is therefore to change planning codes, to attract large retailers, etc. And so it became this kind of very top-down, business-centric approach to addressing a fundamental food justice issue.
Mm.
And what we saw was that in the African context, that idea was starting to be picked up and translated, even though it made no sense in our context. Right? So in the US, a lot of the food deserts, if we're going to go with that definition, are there because large grocery stores retreated from those areas for a number of reasons.
Mm.
In the African context, we never had a lot of supermarkets.
Like India.
And yet now, yeah, like India, like Latin America, although Latin America is much further along in this supposed transition to the supermarket economy. And so this, now we are working towards indicators that talk about kind of food equity in cities that use the language of food deserts and use the indicator of supermarkets, even though it doesn't really make sense in our context. So what we're seeing in the African context is this kind of expansion of the supermarket sector and this assumption that it's good for food security. But the work that we've been doing, kind of looking at how people are actually getting food, suggests that maybe that's not as simple and that we need to completely reframe the idea of the food deserts in the African context and in the Indian context and in most places in the global south.
You think the definition of food desert does give a lot of importance to supermarkets as the sole source of food for a lot of people? Because I mean, I've never been to Africa and I don't know what the food system is like, but in India, a lot of vegetables that we would get up until 8 years, 10 years ago would be from vegetable farmers markets, vegetable markets. There's a whole different typologies which is called mandis, where just different people who sell fruits and vegetables would gather and you just buy from it. And there's also very interestingly, I mean, interesting as in we've all grown up with it, but you'd also have vendors coming on carts, walking around the road to where you live, and you just buy from that person. You don't necessarily even need to go somewhere to buy your food. It's almost like that vendor comes around and you buy it. But even if you were to take like a sample area in a particular city where uh, there exists no supermarket in its traditional sense, but there's also a lot of these other ways in which people get their food, does that kind of undermine or question the whole definition?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we have the same phenomenon where you have these multiple forms of small scale and informal food retailing that happens on the street, in small shops, etc. And yet the narrative that's come through has been that the supermarket provides food that is cheaper, more diverse, safer.
Mm.
And therefore it becomes the obvious choice for people. And yet what we've seen is that doesn't necessarily become the obvious choice. So in all the places we've worked at where other researchers have done work, people will transition to supermarkets for particular things at particular times.
Mm.
So people will transition to buying kind of the non-perishables from the supermarkets, but will still go to the fresh fruit vendor that they know. They will still go to the fresh meat vendor that they will know. They'll still go to the street trader. And it's partly because those traders are working in a way that meets the needs of the population. So you can buy in small quantities. You can buy on credit when the money runs out. They'll open all kinds of hours. They're conveniently located. So there's a lot of benefits to the traditional systems. And the idea that the supermarket's going to come in and have all these benefits and that system's going to fade away doesn't seem to be holding out. The question is, why is this supermarket idea getting such traction? And I think it's getting traction because it's a simple solution to a complex problem. And we all know that policy like policymakers like a simple. Let me try that again. We all know that policymakers like a simple solution to a complex problem. The other one is recognizing the kind of finance behind this and the power of developers and large retailers to drive the urban planning agenda. We've all got to recognize this. So I think those are a couple of components that are shaping this narrative. But I think also there's something about how we map and represent things.
Yeah.
So some of the work we've done has been mapping out where supermarkets are and laying them over census tracts, demonstrating areas of low income. And when you look at the city scale, well, you can see there's food deserts. You can see there's this kind of inequity, and that's there if you look at something at the city scale and if you look at supermarkets and income. However, when you go down to the neighborhood scale, which you can't map at the city scale, you can't map all of the 500 vendors operating within a single ward in the city. You can't map the kind of ephemerality. You're talking about the carts that go from place to place. How do you map that? How do you represent that? How do you make that visible to planners and policymakers?
Yeah,
so again, there's something about how we represent.
Yeah, I want to probe a little bit into that, because you said this kind of a research is, I mean, there is an aspect of, the qualitative analysis and the quantitative analysis and the economics behind it. But what I found very interesting about your methodology was you were really looking at people's lived experiences, and a lot of your information and your analysis came from that lived experience versus purely just looking at a city in a plan and like marking supermarkets there.
Yeah, I mean, at the heart of our work has always been trying to understand how people themselves make sense of their food environment and how they live it, and what are the interactions of the food system with the urban system, with social systems, how those things all come together. And I think that's been absent, particularly in our context, from the way in which planning has been done. And so part of the efforts we've been doing is trying to bring that lived experience to the surface, to kind of create narratives that policymakers and planners are going to be able to understand and start to incorporate into their approaches.
Would that look like, I don't know, what would that process look like? Would you imagine it to be, I don't know, some kind of a participatory, crowdsourced process? How do you imagine it being translated into policies?
So there's a couple of things that we've been doing to create that. So the one is using very qualitative methods to understand lived experience. And we're doing that for a few reasons. Firstly, I think you often end up with quite siloed data, and so we need to kind of create those rich narratives. The other thing has been distilling the rich, complex data into a kind of compelling narrative to generate political will. So in the current work, we've created the story of a child called Nosipo, and we travel with her through a day. And we put that to policymakers, and suddenly they can start to have conversations across the silos because they've got a story they can relate to. We've also been doing quite a lot of work with visual. So we've used photo exhibitions linked with text from interviews to kind of bring the story to life and to immerse the policymakers and planners in that world. I found that to be quite effective. But the other element that's been, I think, something we'd hoped for, but we're only starting to see fruition of now, is that the participants in that lived experience research start to be able to see the systems in ways that they don't necessarily do when you're just living it. So that act of being a part of the research has actually created community agency and community voice. And so in one of the projects we've been working in, we've actually managed to work with some of the participants to form a kind of ambassadors group who are now going to policymakers and speaking to them. So they've invited the city's environmental health unit, who do all the street safety, food safety work, to come and speak to them, to explain to them the processes so they can explain what the traders need to do in order to be compliant, so that the environmental health just don't come in and shut them down with no reason or without explanation. So it's actually seeing that the research process itself can create kind of a bridge between the policymaker and the community.
Which is my next point, and which is what another just kind of eye-opening view from a young architect planner's perspective is you've been advocating, or you've been going to let that loud, noisy vehicle pass.
Yeah.
We actually have the Indian New Year next week as I'm recording. It's a week from now, Diwali.
Yes.
And so there's
Diwali.
a lot of crackers going on in the background. A lot of kids are just bursting crackers. But
Already.
Oh, already. Yeah. I mean, people need to like stop it at some point in the night because it just goes on. And on the Diwali day and the New Year's day, they burst crackers throughout the night. You wake up to like a very foggy sky. It's kind of ridiculous, but
yeah. So in South Africa, we have one city, Durban, that has a very large Indian diaspora, and they're sort of getting very ready. And I think there's been some action by the municipality to give dogs calming drugs ahead of it because the noise is just
it's too
extreme.
much. Yeah, we have two, but I mean, of course, Indian households and very noisy households, they don't get scared as much. But otherwise, I can imagine for, street dogs and stuff, it must be really loud because it just boom. Okay, what was I talking about? Yes, I was going to talk about food-driven planning or food-sensitive planning. And in the podcast that you produced, you hosted, and the paper that you wrote about, well, multiple papers and essays, you were actually proposing a new kind of an approach towards looking at urban planning, which was to really have food safety, food infrastructure, or the infrastructure necessary to deliver that kind of food security, food safety, and have that as one of the key points in terms of how we design cities and how we plan cities and how we make neighborhoods. We could talk about that, but then I also want to talk about the emphasis on creating the infrastructure to have that kind of a planning approach, because just like supermarkets, I mean, it's not a simple act of just going to a supermarket, right? You have to take out time, you have to have a vehicle, and then you need to go drive to that place. You need to park there, you need to do your shopping, and then you need to come back home. So you need a mode of transportation, you need a way or a road to kind of go on, and you need access to that place, and access in terms of physical access, monetary access, etc., etc. But how does one really process food sensitive planning? What does it look like?
I'm taking a slight pause because it's a complex answer.
I know it's loaded. So, I had to give everything I had.
No. So how do we start to think about food sensitive planning? So within our work, one of the things we've been trying to advocate for is to try and get planning to consider food as a let's think about that again. I think you might have to edit this. So within our work, one of the things we've been really trying to advocate for is to have food as an object of planning, and to recognize the role of food in shaping our cities. And so there's a couple of components to this. The first one is thinking about, why is it that we haven't planned for food? So as Wayne Roberts used to say, more than any of our biological needs, the choices that we make about food affect the shape, the style, pulse, smell, look, feel, health, economy, street life, and infrastructure of the city. And so when you start to think about how many times your life intersects with food and how many things shape why you do what you do with food, it does seem very odd that planners haven't really engaged with food that much. And so what we've been trying to do is say, well, there's two things that we need to think about in terms of food and planning. One is the food specific planning. So thinking about where you place market sites, how you design informal trade plans that incorporate food as an active process in that. So if we have an informal trader policy in the city of Cape Town. It's about livelihoods and economics. It's not about what's getting sold. And so the failure to think about food in that means that you don't have supportive infrastructure for food safety. It means you don't have safe storage spaces for traders, all of which not only undermine their businesses, but undermine food safety, undermine access to food. Another element where you might think about food specific planning is when a planning application comes in for a new shopping mall, of which we have many, and they always have a supermarket as an anchor tenant, and they always have a couple of fast food joints kind of associated with them as well. One of the things we've been saying is, well, in order to get planning permission in the South African context, you need to have an environmental impact assessment. In
Mm.
some cases, you'll need to have a transport impact assessment. You'll need to have, in some cases, a heritage impact assessment. Could we think about the idea of having a food impact assessment where the developer will have to explain what the impact on the food system and food security might be? There's other food specific elements like, well, how do you start to incorporate urban agriculture into your zoning plans? Those things are quite obvious. But as you were saying earlier, there's a whole lot of other aspects of planning that intersect with how people access and utilize food.
Mm.
And so this goes from everything from, yes, transport design. We know that transport infrastructure correlates quite closely with food trade. How do you start to think about the connections between those things? What's the design element around transit that's going to mean that people aren't commuting for 2.5 hours to get to work every day, and that fundamentally shapes what they do with food?
Yeah.
So we're starting to think about food sensitivity there. When we're thinking about design of new neighborhoods, how might you do that in a way that incorporates aspects of community composting, which incorporates gardens, which incorporates kind of trading spaces within those areas? But then when you go down to the house scale, what kind of housing infrastructure enables people to make the kinds of decisions they want to make about food?
Mm.
What kind of access to energy and energy security, water and sanitation, even things like the presence or an absence of a ceiling in a house affects the kind of thermal gradient in the house, which
Yeah.
affects what you can buy and store.
Mm.
So everything from that kind of micro scale design of within the house to the macro design of your kind of city transit plan, all of those things have food implications. And so we think there's a role for trying to embed kind of food sensitivity and certainly the language of food security within kind of things like our metropolitan spatial development frameworks, which kind of sets the development plan for the whole city.
Right.
The integrated development plan, the district plan. And if we can get that language into those kind of large scale planning documents, it can start to feed through into practice.
Mm.
So that's part of it. And I think the way that traction is going to come from this is by recognizing that having a food secure population with a well thought out food system isn't just about food. It's about health, but it's also about environmental justice. It's also about employment and livelihoods. It's about livability of the city. It's about waste management. So all these kind of objectives
Yeah.
that municipal governments might have could be met more effectively if they were to start thinking of food as a kind of crucial element of the city's metabolism.
Mm. It almost seems like, now with a sudden rise in the woke culture, as they call it, it seems like everything that is happening with organic food, farmers market, things that are now starting to be trendy were things that already existed before supermarkets ever happened. It's just that now it's more fashionable to go to a farmers market, whereas maybe early back in the day it would probably have been frowned upon when supermarkets were just coming up, that sort of aggregation of everything into one place, versus now there being a certain distribution of different kind of foods, and then the act of going there and buying something that's fresh and that's also healthy. Because I feel like what often happens is, when we look at the kind of food that's available through these different mediums, there's also an aspect of health and nutrition that kind of gets backtracked. Because I was talking to one of the other guests, and I realized, and she pointed out very rightly, that it's not necessary that if your food's secure, you're eating healthy. It's not necessary that whatever you're consuming, whatever food you have, you might not be hungry, but that food doesn't also necessarily have to be nutritional. You could just be living close to a dollar store or something where you could buy frozen meats, and you could be eating and heating and eating it up. But it doesn't mean you're getting any vitamins, any proteins, any nutrients out of it. If you were to kind of integrate that aspect as well in terms of health and nutrition, do you think there could be scope in planning and in urban design to really even talk about not just the availability of food, but also the kind of food? For example, I'm just thinking out loud, when cities like Ahmedabad, where I'm from, they started growing, the town planning schemes had space for retail commercial buildings. And so those retail and commercial buildings would have the supermarkets, which would sell your fruits and vegetables. People realized not too late that it's not necessarily a preferred mode of purchase for a lot of people. It's a social activity, people really like to go together. My mother and my neighbors, for example, would make a trip out of it, and you really want to browse and you want to haggle with different vendors and you really want to have your pick of the lot. And the supermarket did not let any of those informal conversations to happen. It wasn't experiential anymore. And so a lot of the street edges where that informal hawking used to happen, that vendors used to just come lay their produce, which were moved to make space for the retail commercial parks, um, faced a lot of backlash from people, because there used to be these smaller nuclear markets, so-called markets, in very close proximity to people's place, but then they were replaced by supermarkets, which were at slightly farther proximity. And so the later town plans actually made space, not the best designs, but they did account for those kind of informal vending activities to happen, where uh, they were given a particular space in the town plan, in the city plan, like an allocated space where they could come and the same kind of interactions would happen. And it's in slightly different, like more sanitized form, if I could say that, but it was made a part of the planning.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot going on within this kind of space. So as you were saying, the kind of this kind of rediscovery of those more traditional vending systems as having these benefits for potentially for health and well-being, the kinds of foods that are perhaps getting sold in these spaces. Certainly the kind of connection to cultural food practices is something that the supermarkets have really struggled to deliver on,
Yep.
or to struggle to deliver on authentically.
Yeah.
And the kind of social activity, the social practice of purchasing and networking and all those kinds of dynamics. So I think those are crucially important. I think one of the challenges that we're finding is there's still this kind of deep antipathy of the state towards that kind of vending, because of these public health concerns that pervade, right? But the public health argument, I think, has been, I don't want to say overemphasized, but we know that there's been various studies that have shown that actually the safety of a lot of street foods is actually safer than a lot of supermarket foods, particularly in terms of meat, because it's super fresh.
Yeah.
It hasn't had time to do that. But if you look at, certainly in the African context, kind of colonial planning and legislation, the primary responsibility of local government regarding food was public health and safety. And so that's the lens through which they will see this. And that's the lens which they've had that element. So I think if we can start to reframe, so one of the things that we've done and then the City of Cape Town has subsequently done is to go through all of the local government constitutional mandates and see where they intersect with food. And then this kind of realization that actually we have a lot of responsibilities towards food that aren't just health and safety.
Yeah.
And so in doing that, it kind of opens up a potential imagining of new ways of being and doing. There are these efforts to try and incorporate some of what was getting lost. So like you're saying, with this kind of provision of spaces, albeit less than ideal for street traders. I've had a student who was doing some work in Cape Town looking at some of the municipal provided spaces. And again, just that unless the planners really understand how these spaces work and why, they often end up being white elephants.
Yeah.
And so we've seen where there's been municipal trading bays put completely away from where foot traffic is.
Mm,
We've seen, even in the context where sort of being set back 3 meters from the road has a profoundly negative effect on trading, and then the
mm,
traders don't want to operate there. So I think again there needs to be a really deep understanding from planners informed by lived experience about how and why people do what they're doing in these spaces. But my abiding sense is that these kinds of spaces and having this kind of retail diversity is fundamental to a resilient food system. To a food system that not only gives people resilience, so they can kind of have choice, they can have agency. There's things that supermarkets do better than informal
sure,
traders. There's
sure.
things that informal traders do better than supermarkets. We've got to I say we've got to. My sense is that in order to maintain people's resilience to shocks, economic, social, whatever, they need to have a diverse food system.
Mm,
And so we need to be able to plan that kind of diversity. At the same time, I think that having that kind of diversity also has benefits more broadly. So not just for the food insecure, So we've had a context where, I mean, right now we've had these incredibly high food prices globally as a result of the Ukraine crisis.
yeah, yeah.
And in India, you've had the droughts, And so if you have a diverse food system that's getting food from multiple sources with multiple flows and multiple kinds of economic relationships, then there's a kind of robustness to that system.
Mm,
And so I think if we fall for this narrative that one kind of food system is going to be the most appropriate and we must plan for that, I think we're going to be ultimately undermining the resilience of our food systems, the resilience of our cities, and the resilience of our populations. And so we've got to think about what kinds of food systems increase agency and sustainability.
yeah. And something you said in our first meeting was quite profound because you said there's a lot of work being done internationally through nonprofit organization, through humanitarian organizations, and you said there's a lot of aid, but there's not a lot of agency, and that kind of really stuck with me because we might be trying our best to make sure there's no food shortage, but then what are we really doing in terms of giving access and agency to the people who consume that food? So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to ask you my favorite and my most frequently asked questions. That question is, what are you working on and what's next for you? I know there's a large project that's a kind of international, multi-country, big project that you're working on. But if you also want to tell us anything about work in the food area that you're doing, we'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, so there's two large things that I'm working on at the moment, and they span vastly different global scales. So the one piece is I'm currently writing a report with the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, the FAO.
Mhm.
They have this thing called the High Level Panel of Experts that writes a series of reports that then go through this process to ultimately go into kind of global recommendations.
Right.
And we're in the middle of doing a report on inequalities in food and nutrition security and understanding the drivers of that.
You are talking about nutrition, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so we're looking at kind of what's driving food and nutrition insecurity in its broader scope. So not simply the kind of micronutrient malnutrition, the hunger, but also the kind of burgeoning obesity, diet-related non-communicable diseases, all of that stuff. And
Sure.
what we're doing is we're adding an equity lens to that. And we're
Mm,
saying, okay, so we've got these inequalities in experience, and they're driven by things that are happening in the food system and wider systems. So kind of making those systems linkages. But these are driven by inequitable processes. So trying to understand what kinds of inequity are present and how to factor in these issues of justice into addressing inequality. So it's really, not finding the band-aid solution, but really digging into the kind of systemic drivers and taking a kind of rights-based understanding of the challenge.
mm,
And so that's kind of trying to draw on case studies from all around the world and trying to feed into kind of global governance discussions, which feeds into national policy discussions, which feeds down. And then at the other end, I'm working with a couple of community groups here in Cape Town, in which we're still trying to continue doing this lived experience research and still trying to find ways to increase community voice and try to embed some of the thinking around food systems transformation at that kind of micro neighborhood scale. And the challenge is making those conversations talk to each other. And that's kind of where I'm finding the most intellectual stimulation. And again, it's thinking about, well, how does what happens at that global scale filter down to
what happens at the
lived
local
experience?
Yeah.
But likewise, how do those experiences start to then filter up to change those global decision-making processes?
Yeah, I mean, even the stuff that we talked about today kind of spans the ends, right? At some point, we spoke about the storage space in people's houses, and if they have the infrastructure to, buy cranes and store cranes, or if they have refrigerators to store dairy for a longer time, and then zoomed out to look at the infrastructure that makes all of this possible. So it really connects at that level where you cannot look at one without looking at the other, and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that we don't live at one scale. We're kind of living at this. So we're living in these multiple spatial experiences all the time. And yet so often when we're thinking about planning and design, we're thinking at the precinct scale, we're thinking at the neighborhood scale, we're thinking at the city scale. But how do we start to make sure that those things are always in conversation
Dialogue,
with each other?
Yeah. Well, good luck with that research. It sounds absolutely fantastic. And thank you for accepting our invitation. This was fun.
Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
Yep.
Thanks, Vaishnavi.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. For guest and topic suggestions, you can get in touch with us through Instagram or our website arcofcenter.com, both of which are ARCHOFFCENTRE. And thank you for listening.